as a preface to introducing Damon, I worked for 30 years within a block or three of Lake Merritt. And so many lunchtimes I would walk around Lake Merritt and was doing it more for the exercise and to work off the stress of the job. But took it for granted that Lake Merritt is just there and never gave a thought to what was underneath it, much less at the bottom of it and what creatures might grow there. So I'm really looking forward to introducing you now to Damon Tighe. And I asked Damon if he'd like me to do an introduction of his background and all, and we agreed that who better than he to do that. So Damon, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
All right, sounds good. So my name is Damon Tighe. I've been living by Lake Merritt since about April 2000, moved back here from Montana. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of my kind of career background because I think it does play a little bit into the presentation that you'll see, and then we'll do the deep dive into the critters of Lake Merritt. So I grew up in Calaveras County in California, which usually when I tell most people like that, they're just like, where? And it's about 3 hours directly east of the Bay Area. It's in the Sierra foothills. It's most famous for Mark Twain's short story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, which was basically the foundation of the economy of where I grew up, which was a story about guys getting drunk in a bar, betting on their frogs jumping, and one guy putting lead shot in one of the frogs while the other guy was taking a piss. So from Calaveras, I ended up at St. Mary's College in Moraga, California. I pursued a biology chemistry degree there. I went and I taught high school in Portland, Oregon, and then moved down to the San Francisco Bay Area again to work on the Human Genome Project. So I spent about 10 years at the National Labs on the Human Genome Project, and then a host of related full genome sequencing projects. And then about 10 years ago, I moved over to Biorad Laboratories, which is a biotech company that's been around since about the 1950s. So as far as biotech goes, that's pretty old. Or I would say, like to say, foundational. And so I've been working with them to help drive more hands-on biotechnology experiences into classrooms. And that's mainly because I was at the National Labs. I found a lot of people were coming out of four-year colleges, good on the theory, but then you'd give them tools and you're like, ooh, I thought you went to college. I was hoping you would actually be able to translate all those thoughts into doing stuff. And so that's been my kind of career trajectory. On the backside of that, I've been managing an apartment complex in downtown Oakland since 2004 when I moved here, which has been interesting on all sorts of levels, connected to the community around Oakland and then also close to the lake. And in the background, I helped start a nonprofit called the California Center for Natural History, which is basically a roof for a bunch of local naturalists to work underneath in order to do more public education about environmental issues kind of locally, because there's a lot of education for people, but not as many for adults. And we're making decisions about our local environments via the way we spend our money and through our votes every day. Our big focus of that was to kind of get more education for urban adults. With that being said, I'll drop into this PowerPoint, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at kind of the natural history, human history of Lake Merritt. We'll do a break to kind of talk about any of the content that came up there, and then we'll dive into the critters. And so just to kind of frame this, the whole reason I got interested in documenting the organisms at Lake Merritt was mainly due to a walk I went on in the mid-2000s given by Joel Peters, who was one of the architects of Measure DD. Measure DD was a bond that basically put a lot of money into cleaning up kind of the waterways of Lake Merritt. And so I started going down to Lake Merritt very consciously, trying to photograph organisms to document, even though it wasn't quantitative, but kind of to give visuals to the changes that were going on in the lake by getting nice photographic evidence of the organisms in the lake. And along that process, learned a lot about these various organisms, where they're from, and kind of their histories, which when it comes to a biology point of view are really interesting, but we'll dig into that in that part of the talk. So with that being said, let's look at of the general natural history of Lake Merritt. So it's been there for about 10,000 years, ever since the last ice age, from what we can tell. And this photograph there is what it looks like. We're thinking about, 10,000 years ago. And you see that Alameda at that point was still kind of joined on to the mainland. The humans hadn't gotten involved and dug that, corner around Alameda that happened within the last kind of 100 years or so. First human settlements, from what we can tell, were around Lake Merritt Basin around 4000 BCE. And we have evidence of that based upon shell mounds that were on the east side of what's now known as Lake Merritt. And then getting closer to when Europeans show up, the Ohlone and the Coastanoans are the people that we find there. And they seem to have started there around 6000 in the current era. When we look at kind of the European years of Lake Merritt was part of the large Rancho San Antonio land grant, which was about 45,000 acres given by Luis Peralta, the last Spanish governor of California, to kind of his sons. So one of his sons had this property, but he had it kind of in a rough era, long enough to kind of see it and have large dominion over it, and then to see it kind of squandered away by just tons of settlers flooding into California, as kind of, the word about gold gets out, etc. And so after a short period of time, his land has more or less been broken out, not due to his desire, but to people coming in and kind of settling on it. 1853 is when you get the first toll bridge that's built across the San Antonio Creek, which is basically where the Lake Merritt kind of basin was draining into the bay. And that's more or less connecting what is downtown Oakland right now and what used to be named Brooklyn, the east side of the lake. And the east side of the lake was named Brooklyn mainly because a bunch of the settlers from there, which happened to be Mormons, came over on a boat from basically the New York area. And if you've ever been up to the Mormon temple up in Oakland Hills, there's a little plaque about that boat if you're into kind of geography or history, treasure hunting in the Oakland Hills area. 1869 is when the first dam gets built across basically the 12th Street Bridge area. And that's mainly due to Samuel Merritt, who was the mayor of the city at the time. And around 1870, we got a population of about 100,000 people living around Lake Merritt, or at least that drainage. And so just to kind of put a visual on it, you basically go from that to this very urban dense space that we see today. And so you can think about how that has probably changed water quality over those years as well. Lake Merritt derives its name from Samuel Merritt, who was the mayor of Oakland, the 13th mayor, very imposing character at 6'3", 340 pounds. You definitely knew when he was in the room. He definitely swayed his weight around in business, being part of the Oakland Waterfront Company, which basically controlled all of the shorelines in Oakland, including Lake Merritt. So basically, if you wanted to pay to harbor yourself or move goods, you were kind of more or less having to pay this company to get access. He, though, ultimately gets his name attached to Lake Merritt, partly because of some of the work that he does around Lake Merritt. So he's involved in that damming of the creek, but even more so, he's the one that ultimately gets Lake Merritt to be considered and basically approved as the first wildlife refuge. Oh. What's going on here? Let me jump back in. I'm not sure. Looks like somebody.
Just start again.
Okay, yep.
Yeah, there you go.
There we go. Okay, so he basically petitions the governor of California at the time, Henry Haight, to get this bill passed that designates Lake Merritt as a wildlife refuge. And so part of the, stories that go behind this is that Merritt, since he lived close to the lake, he was really tired of having gunfire go off close to his home. You guys remember, Lake Merritt is this phenomenal stopover for ducks during the wintertime. You also had kind of the Wild West nature of California at this time. So people were having bear fights down at the lake where they'd trap bears from up in the hills, bring them down, have these kind of public fights. It's just a pretty wild space. And so Merritt is able to get the Wildlife Refuge notified and is kind of able to slow down the hunting of things that were going on at the lake. Supposedly his neighbor's cow got shot leading up to this too, and he had a couple windows shot out. So you can see that there's probably a little personal impetus to also get this Wildlife Refuge designation for the space. And that ultimately is why it kind of starts getting the nickname Merritt's Lake, and then ultimately Lake Merritt. Part of the reason that it was dammed was also to deal with a lot of the stench Lake Merritt was having around Merritt's time, which was caused by all of the Oakland hills were more or less draining down to Lake Merritt. And if everyone's taking their bedpans and other things they don't want and placing it in that water stream, it was all ending up down at Lake Merritt. And so you can imagine what it smells like when the tide goes out and all of this stuff has a chance to get really well oxygenated. It wasn't really a fantastic scent. And so that was part of the reason that that dam was built. But if you look at kind of the turn of the last century, there was so much sediment coming down on the Glen Echo watershed and the other streams coming down to the lake that the city engineers were reporting 1 inch of sedimentation every year due to waste. And so in 1893, the city actually started dredging the lake in order to deal with an enormous amount of sedimentation that was taking place. And so a lot of this material that was dredged became more infrastructure around the 12th Street Dam. It also became the iconic bird islands that now are up at the top side of the lake. And then everything kind of gets glossed, or gets a nice shiny glossing on it through about 1907 through 1925, when you have the city beautification projects going on that kind of creates the parklands around the lake, ultimately ends up spurring out the string of lights, and then trying to basically get rid of that impression that Lake Merritt's a cesspool with lots of sewage in it. And so that's where you've gone from basically this, scene of the early 1890s to that bridge getting built in 1892 that gets filled in. And then the kind of beautification project where you have this focus on making it a parkland that people are going to come to and enjoy. One of the things that I like to show people is people always ask me, well, can you swim in Lake Merritt now? And you say, well, yeah, I mean, it's just about as clean as the San Francisco Bay. And then people are always like, but people used to be able to swim in. And I was like, well, yeah, but those pictures that you see of people swimming in it, like this one from 1908 that often surfaces in media all over the place. This was also the time that we were dredging the lake for that fecal sedimentation that was happening, year round at 1 inch a year. And so a lot of what people perceive about the lake has come down, I would say, to very good marketing and not necessarily what's really going on in the lake at all times. Let me jump through those. So the big tide change, I would say, kind of starts to take place in the 80s, where city engineers finally route most of the sewer pipes away from Lake Merritt and actually into the appropriate treatment plants. Basically the one at West Oakland. And then 2002 is that big, I think, cornerstone change for what we see in the lake right now, which was the Measure DD project that brought almost $200 million to the table to basically clean up the water inputs to the lake. So that was working on the 62 storm drains, the 8 creek flows that come into the lake, and then also going to that channel that's been filled in over the years that happens between kind of where the 12th Street Dam was and where Laney College is, and actually widening that. So that way Lake Merritt will have the same kind of tidal flow it used to have before that dam was built. And the goal behind that is to get more oxygenation in the lake. Because half the reason the lake has these fountains is due to the fact that when they dam the lake, what would take place is, especially during the summer, you'd have these huge blooms of algae. And then when those start to die, you have these giant O2 drops. And when that O2 starts to drop, everything else starts dying, and Lake Merritt becomes a real stinky place really quickly. And so those fountains were put in to actually aerate the water during those low oxygen events. But then the widening of the channel to get it back to kind of, pre-human messing with it days will hopefully get more tidal flush in there, which will also help with oxygenation of the lake. And so that's one of the last major projects that's been going on with Measure DD that you can actually see is the widening of the channel. They've kind of finished the majority of that now and are now starting to go back through and try to planting in these kind of saltwater estuary plants into that space, which has been really kind of cool to see those retake over the channel. So that's things like salt pickle weeds and things like that. Another historical piece in there that is important that happens before Measure DD from a biology point of view is what happens in the 1960s at Lake Merritt. That basically is the foundation of an entire branch of biological studies now, known as the study of marine invasives. So prior to a high school kid who's leaning over the dock there in that blue hat, Jim Carlton, everyone kind of considered that there wasn't probably invasive species in marine environments because all the oceans touch each other more or less. And so if an organism wanted to get from one place to another, it would have already been there. So the distributions we see must be because of other factors than things not being able to get places. And well, Jim Carlton at the ripe age of like 16 or so shot a bunch of holes in that because he was going to Lake Merritt, finding organisms in the lake and then identifying them, bringing them over to Berkeley and getting some help. And he started to find stuff that when he brought it over to Berkeley, people there couldn't identify it. And he started to realize by looking through some magazines that some of these organisms were from Australia. Coincidentally, one of the port trading partners with Oakland at the time. And so what Jim stumbles upon is that, yes, you can actually have invasive species that end up from one place in the world to the other. And really, there was a barrier to these things getting places, and it's the pelagic ocean is not an easy place to get across. It's a pretty formidable barrier. But boats going back and forth from ports that pull up bilge water can pull up organisms from their environment, ship them all across the world, and then drop them off in another port when they dump that water and pull on new water. And so Lake Merritt is this crazy assortment of organisms from all over the world from ports that Oakland is traded with. And so the majority of these organisms I'm going to show you are not native to the West Coast. Most of them are from Asia, Australia, the Mediterranean, basically any place that we've kind of done business with over time, which is kind of wild. Jim continues to be one of the world experts in marine invasive species. He's now over at Williams College, but anytime you see any kind of big get together around marine invasive species, he's always one of the keynote speakers, which is really cool. He's still very involved with the lake. So anytime we find something interesting, we'll send it over to Jim, and he'll look at it and kind of go through it and, figure out what's going on there, which has been really, really cool to have his continual participation in the public understanding Lake Merritt. Following in his footsteps, we have Andrew Cohen, who's still local to the Bay Area that kind of comes through occasionally and does surveys of Lake Merritt. And then also the Smithsonian's Tiburon branch that's associated with San Francisco State will occasionally do more scientific studies still in the lake. So with that, let's take a little pause and I'll handle any questions that came up during that time before we jump into actually looking at some of these critters.
Damon, Roger asks, how salty is the lake?
Excellent question. It depends on the time of year. And that is because you've got all that fresh water flowing down from the hills into Lake Merritt, but you also have the connection to the San Francisco Bay. And so it's a brackish water system that fluxes during the year. So this year, Lake Merritt basically was like the San Francisco Bay the whole year because we really never saw a decent rain event. But traditionally what we would see is we get a brackish water system in there during the rainy season, and then something that looks much more like the San Francisco Bay salt content during the summers, which means that Lake Merritt has also been a really good proving ground for not only just any organism that was picked up at those other ports, but organisms that can survive in a brackish water system. So they're ones that can handle the regular salt water, but can also survive, an influx of fresh water at times. Good question. In fact, we're going to go down after this talk. I'm going down to sample water this evening at 5 o'clock to kind of see where we're at. And I guarantee you we're already at the San Francisco Bay salinity from my gut feeling. Any other questions?
I would ask is I had the same idea about asking about the salinity. How about the pH? Is that similar to what you'd find at the ocean side?
Yeah, it's similar to what you see in the San Francisco Bay, but not necessarily the direct ocean. So it's a little more acidic than what you'd find like, offshore a little bit, but it is similar to what we find in the San Francisco Bay. It, however, though, can get a couple more, I'd say, fluxes, usually down in pH in the wintertime, potentially, just due to stuff running off the streets and out of the hills into the lake. Any other water quality questions?
I thought I saw another chat question from, was it Roger? Did you have one?
Yeah, I just wanted to see if there's anything that the city or other agency does to try to balance regulate the chemical balance or the salt content. I mean, is there any concern about keeping it in a certain biological friendly condition?
I mean, I think the approach the city's kind of taken on with Measure DD is if it can basically be connected to the bay more frequently by widening that channel, it will reinstate basically the biological buffer of the bay water at a higher degree. And so that seems to be the trajectory the city's taken. The one thing I have to admit that I kind of wish Measure DD had written into it more was a very controlled kind of study of what was going on at the lake as these different water quality improvements got put in place. Because I feel like people, saw them and said, okay, if we can keep trash out of the lake, that would be great. If we can increase oxygen at the lake, that would be great. But there hasn't been a nice long-term quantitative study to show how these changes have necessarily manifest. And so that's why we have a lot of just kind of qualitative looks at what's going on in the lake through, the progress of Measure DD. Qualitatively, I mean, it's even to somebody walking by, it's noticeably different these days. I mean, if you go out there today, right now, as you walk around the lake, you can look down and see the bottom of the lake, which I can tell you in the early 2000s, even when I moved here, wasn't something you could consistently do. And a lot of that has been kind of dealing with, broken sewer material that was finding its way to the lake through some of the in-washes. And we occasionally see a couple of those now, as there's so much construction going on in downtown Oakland. Occasionally somebody will do a small rupture on a sewer that then ends up kind of draining into the lake, but it's usually caught really quick and then amended pretty quickly now. So qualitatively, there's definitely been major changes. I just wish that there was more quantitative stuff to lean upon to show this is what other cities could be doing to clean up their waterways. Because I think Lake Merritt is actually a really good example of this kind of concept of rewilding per se, trying to clean up areas that have been impacted by human activity to a point where things can kind of get back to some degree of biological equilibrium again.
I know that your talk is primarily about what's under the water, but just a brief interest in birds in particular. It's a big bird refuge, and has it always been that way? I mean, you would think that the water quality would have an effect on the health of the bird populations.
Yeah, and I'm surprised that I haven't seen Audubon more involved in wanting to understand the water there. Actually, ironically, the slide deck I'm going to share with you guys, the only reason this slide deck ever really came together and why this isn't just a random kind of assortment of photographs I had sitting on a computer was because Audubon asked me to run a course on what the birds might be eating at Lake Merritt. A lot of these invertebrates I'm going to show to you. Water quality from a bird point of view probably isn't as big of a thing as long as there were things growing in the water that they could get a hold of and eat. And Lake Merritt has a long tradition of birds like you've mentioned. Not only did Merritt kind of make the wildlife refuge because he wanted to have people stop shooting birds next to his house and blowing out his windows, but the whole reason that Lake Merritt had the Rotary Nature Center, more or less, which was one of the first, I think the guy there was the first funded naturalist in the United States. And it was basically a bird program where he was coming out and feeding birds, and he, these huge swaths of birds, that would come and aggregate for these feedings. And the public would come by, and he would teach them about what different bird species were there. And so the birds have been a central portion of interaction with human eyes per se at the lake ever since it's been there.
I believe Carol Kazaya had a question.
I was just wondering if there were still funds available in Measure DD.
I think there is some funds available. I'm not sure when things are kind of slated to run out, but a couple more years, if I remember right. I still see a couple emails back and forth from the Measure DD kind of crew, which makes me think there's still funds there for them to keep kind of working on stuff. Most of the major projects, though, I say, are kind of coming to a close. The channel widening and the cleanup of all those storm drains. I mean, it's something that is hard for everybody to see because most of it happened underground, a lot of the stuff they've done, but it's made a huge impact on how much trash makes its way to the lake. So there's a lot of these really impressive swale systems that were built topside, but then also these kind of aggregators underground where the city can basically pop a manhole cover, and these things kind of form these vortexes that will capture the trash that floats on the top and kind of push them up in an area so that they don't make their way into the lake and the city can come by and harvest them. So there's a lot of these kind of beneath the surface amendments that got done that weren't as easy for everybody to see. And I remember when I saw that on my walk with Joel Peters, I was just like, oh, wow, this is going to have some huge effects on what we see, I think, from the biology portion of the lake as well, just because not as much stuff is making it from the streets into the lake.
All right, Damon, perhaps you should move on at this point.
All right, so what I'm going to take you through is kind of a look at the taxonomy of what's in the lake, of strong focus on the invertebrates. And that's mainly because that's what Audubon originally asked for. And the fish have actually surprisingly been a lot harder for me to document than the invertebrates. And I think the invertebrates a lot of times are also a lot showier. And so they kind of capture people's imaginations more. So if we jump into this, we got to think about our primary producers in Lake Merritt, which is all of our photosynthetic organisms. So there's an immense diversity of single-celled alga and large algal clustering bodies that will form in Lake Merritt. And these are what everybody else at the next level are eating. Some of these can come through in some really surprising ways, which is every fall, Lake Merritt has a bioluminescent event in the lake, which is probably caused by this organism, even though we have not been able to get down to a species. When I first saw this event, I thought, okay, this will be easy. I'll go out there, I'll do a plankton tow. Given a week, we'll have a species name on what this is. And the more you dig into it, the more you realize, like, actually, there are a ton of organisms that cause bioluminescent blooms, especially in brackish water systems. And so sharing samples with a handful of labs in California, we at least got down to this genera. But if you ever want to see this, it tends to take place between kind of the new moon in September and October. If you basically go down to the water and splash the water around, you'll see this kind of blue glow in Lake Merritt, which is kind of cool because a lot of people think you got to go someplace tropical to see these type of events. Nope. They're just right there in downtown Oakland. You just got to show up at the right time and take a look around. We also have, a bunch of single-celled organisms that are eating the algae that get missed by everybody. So there's a huge variety of rotifers in the lake. And these are kind of little single-celled organisms that are kind of like vacuums, more or less. They go around and suck up smaller critters, usually algal cells, and eat them. The real big filter feeders, though, when we get away from those kind of primary producers that are obvious to see in the lake, are the tunicates. And these, the common name for them is sea squirts. One of the kind of funny things I always like to bring up to people is, besides the fish in the lake, these are the things most taxonomically related to us in that they are chordates. And I know when you look at that thing on the left, you're thinking that does not look like a chordate. Chordates are things that have, spinal columns basically, but these guys during their juvenile stage kind of look like a little tiny tadpole, and they will swim around and they'll find a place that has good flow and lots of food, and they'll go through catastrophic metamorphosis and basically kind of digest out their former self and then reemerge as this, funnel system. And so these can get up to be about the size of my hand. And these will basically attach to some sort of solid substrate. And they are basically just constantly pulling in Lake Merritt water, concentrating those primary producers. And you can actually see the gut of this one down there at the bottom. So that's the food getting processed right there. And then boom, it gets shot out that smaller kind of siphon looking at the far end of it. From a scientific point of view, these critters are really interesting. These were some of the first chordates studied after we did the human genome, because they're easy to grow and they're a chordate with a really small genome, and you can see right through them, which makes them great for scientific study. Ciona intestinalis, probably the largest of our tunicates in the lake, is originally from kind of Taiwan and like Hong Kong, that kind of area of the world. We also have a native one that shows up in Lake Merritt occasionally, the Pacific solitary sea squirt. It's a little bit smaller, and the way you can kind of tell it apart is it's got kind of orange dots around the intake and the outtake on this organism, and they tend to not be as kind of see-through. We have other tunicates that will aggregate together. So those large ones, you'll see them growing together, but the problem is when you're growing together in a big group like that, somebody's sucking in food and then pooping out, and they're pooping out right next to their neighbor who might accidentally then pull that into their siphon. And so there's a competition that takes place there that's not great for everybody involved. However, some tunicates have figured out a way to avoid that problem by using a communal output tube. And so this, what you're looking at, is a colony of tunicates living together. So each one of those orange dots is an individual, but they share basically a common excrete tube. And so these guys are known as the chain tunicates. And we have a variety of these kind of clustering tunicates that live in the lake. And they're actually really easy to spot because a lot of them have really bright colors. I'm going to show you guys a couple other of these aggregating tunicates. We have the golden star tunicate, aptly named for its shape. Its clusters kind of come in these little flowers or star shapes. They're also bright orange, so very easy to see. They're very common towards the end of the summer, although this year, just because of the low rain event, they've already had kind of a jump start. I'm already seeing these on a lot of substrates around the lake. The other kind of crazy thing about this one is that it has various kind of morphisms when it comes to color. And so this is the same organism, but for whatever reason, it's not producing that orange pigment, and it'll produce kind of purple pigments instead. But what I guess from the studies I've read, when you go through and you kind of do a little bit of genetic work on these, they appear to be the exact same organism. Crazy thing is you'll sometimes find them living really close to each other. So I'm not sure what causes them to go between these colors. If it's just an allele frequency in the population, or if they're responding to something in the environment. We also have sponges that will show up at the lake. None of them are big enough to take home to your bathtub. They tend to be kind of small encrusting sponges. The most common one in Lake Merritt is known as dead man's finger. And you'll see this encrusting everything come midsummer. It'll be on the wall of Lake Merritt. It'll be over the mussels. It'll even be on algae that just grows just during that season. And in fact, in the channel coming into Lake Merritt, there's a green bridge that goes over it. And if you snorkel, which not many people should probably be doing that, but if you snorkel in that area, I mean, it looks like a tropical environment because there's so many of these sponges growing there that there's just fingers coming off the wall left and right. And there's a bunch of those brightly colored tunicates encrusting all over them. I mean, you really feel like you're almost in a tropical environment, and that water gets pretty warm during the summer. So sometimes that channel will be, 70 degrees water, almost bathwater level. Part of the sponges, the way they protect themselves is they form calcium carbonate, basically crystal structures. And that's what you can see there at the bottom right. That's some microscopy I did on one of the sponges above. And those are the little spicules. That is actually why people like using sponges in a bathtub, because you're actually scraping yourself with all these little kind of knives, more or less, which help you exfoliate your skin. But it's also the reason that none of the other organisms in Lake Merritt are necessarily trying to eat the sponge. which is kind of cool. We also have a variety of, actually, I saw a couple of questions come in, so I'm going to stop right there just because we did the tunicates and I want to make sure if the questions are about those, we can kind of stop and get back to those.
Yeah, sure. Roger has a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was in Korea a couple of years ago and found out that the people there eat sea squirts or tunicates, and I didn't have a chance to try it, but if I ever go back, I'm going to try it. But maybe I could just go down to Lake Merritt and catch some of them. What do you think?
You could. I probably would check it out and give it some time to filter, a month or two in an aquarium. But they are a really interesting organism to eat because they're one of the few animals that will produce cellulose. And so they have a really crunchy texture even after cooked. They do have a flavor. I hate to say it, it kind of has a reminiscence of like chicken to the flavor of clam with the crunchiness of broccoli.
So where did you get a chance to try that?
I taught in Korea a couple summers.
Oh.
Where I had it. I haven't seen anybody surprisingly selling them in California yet. But if I do, I know who to let know about it.
Yeah, I'd love to find out.
And the Ciona intestinalis, like I'm surprised nobody has tried to kind of grow that and eat that here because it grows really quickly and you can get really nice sized ones. I think that not enough people have been introduced to the potential of eating them.
Okay.
A question about the bioluminescent organisms, and you said September and October. Is there a particular time of the evening or night that they're most visible?
I mean, basically, the darker you can be there, the easier it's going to be able to see them. And so, I usually will go down there around 10 o'clock at night to see them. And I'll go to the boat docks, or there's a pier at Madison Street. And if you just go down there with like a broomstick, more or less, shake it in the water, you can usually see like a blue hue behind, your paddle. Or I'll go out there and, that photograph was actually from kayaking there at night one time. But that's the easiest way to kind of see it is to kind of stand at the end of one of those once it gets sufficiently dark, which is usually about 10 o'clock at night. And the big thing is, of course, let your eyes kind of adjust, be out there for a while before, because it is, it's a bioluminescence, but it's not, like read a newspaper, buy it bright. It's, okay, yep, I can see blue glow in there. And the amazing thing is, I've gone out and done surveys in the lake to figure out where it's strongest. And it tends to be right in front of the boathouse and then flowing back towards the intake is where the strongest bioluminescence tends to be. And I haven't quite figured out why that is yet. But to be honest, like we didn't even have good documentation of it until 3 years ago that it even took place. It was literally just a myth, it seemed like, that was shared amongst rowers until one of them told me, hey, it's going on, go out there and look. And we got photographs and collected organisms.
Well, I've seen the bioluminescence in Tamales Bay. If you go paddling up there in the fall, you see it. So do you think that's a similar species, or probably hard to tell, huh?
It's a different species from what I've seen. The one at Tamales Bay is a much larger diatom, and I'm blanking on the name right now. It's something with Luna in the species name. Because you'll also see it at Bodega Bay. Also have that. And it's kind of cool if you go to Bodega Bay at night in October, November and walk on the sand, your footprints will occasionally glow out there. But those are ones that like a lot more kind of oxygenation. They're much larger organisms than the ones we have at Lake Merritt. Okay. Any other questions?
I think you can move on, Damon.
All right, into the arthropods. So basically our marine insect buddies, sort of. So we have a whole bunch of copepods that are only accessible through the microscope usually, or arthropods only accessible through the microscope, which are these copepods. And these are also things that are out there eating mainly the primary producers, the algal cells. And there's just a couple photographs of them. A lot of these guys tend to be kind of cyclops looking. They've got one dominant kind of eye system and then branching arms they can use to more or less kind of scoop things to their mouth. When we get up in scale a little bit, one of the more interesting ones we have in the lake are what are known as skeleton shrimp. And they're basically called that because of their very thin body plans. And so actually, here's a better photograph of one. We have skeleton shrimp from what we can tell from all over the world, but I'm going to highlight this one just because it's one of those rare times where you get to find something in Lake Merritt that's actually native. So we do get these California skeleton shrimp in Lake Merritt, and these will usually be found on sponges or sea lettuce. And what they'll do is they'll attach to it with their kind of bottom. It's kind of bound up right now, but there's a whole bunch of little grabbers there. They can basically hold onto a substrate. And then they've got these kind of two almost like big dew claw-like things that they can grab things out of the water column and then pull them in and eat them. And they can be extremely numerous. They're easy to overlook though, because they're relatively small and thin. So the easiest way to see them is usually scoop up some substrate out of Lake Merritt, put it in a dish, and then just let your eyes adjust. And then pretty soon you'll realize there's just whole number of these guys just kind of twitching and waving off of whatever it is you've picked up. These are already in good numbers of the lake right now. We also have some of these larger kind of arthropods, these corypheums out there, and they kind of operate very similar to those copepods, just a larger version of it, where they've basically got kind of arms in front that they can use to scoop up things and then kind of bring them into their mouths. This one, we think, and this is from like Taiwan area. We've got ones that are obviously from Japan based upon the name. And these ones are kind of cool because these are the size that if you're standing in the water, you can see them swim around you. And they kind of look like a hybrid of a lobster tail meets the front of a shrimp. And they can be quite numerous some years. We also have something that you guys might recognize from the terrestrial environment. This kind of looks like your classic roly-poly. But most isopods, this group of arthropods, are marine. And just those roly-polies happen to be the oddballs, those ones that decide to go on to land and hang out with us. This one comes originally from New Zealand and Australia and is responsible for the majority of wood damage in the San Francisco Bay. So these will burrow their ways into piers, docks, or any piece of wood that you drop into the San Francisco Bay. I put a piece of wood in Lake Merritt and I pull it out in about 6 months. It is just riddled with holes. And in a good majority of those holes, you'll find this critter inside of there. We also have some of these isopods that appear to be more kind of parasitic. This is one that will swim around and then attach onto fish and then slowly eat the fish. It's not enough to usually kill the fish unless you get engulfed with a whole bunch of these because they're relatively small. But this is definitely one of the ones that creeped me out the first time I found them in Lake Merritt, because I was there in a pair of sandals in the lake and they started swimming up to my leg. And they give you that kind of impression that they're slightly intelligent and looking at your leg as their next meal. And these I don't find super frequently in the lake, but we've had some good sized kind of blooms of them when we get kind of warm water events. We also find more traditional arthropods in the lake, things like shrimp. So we have the Oriental shrimp in the lake. So this is a species that's consumed in Japan, Taiwan, China. And these guys are very common at Lake Merritt. They're just kind of hard to see because it's really easy to see right through them because they're usually kind of clear. If you put your ear to the water, you can actually hear them a lot of times. You'll hear that clicking noise that shrimp make. Or even easier way to find them is go around Lake Merritt at night with a bright UV light, and they will light up in the same way that scorpions light up under a UV light. These seem to aggregate mainly against kind of the wall around Lake Merritt and any kind of large boulders or heavy substrates in the lake. We also, though, have some natives in the lake when it comes to arthropods. We have the tuberculate pear crab, which is probably the largest crab you'll see in Lake Merritt. You know, they can get up to be about a little bit over a softball and a half size, but they're very hard to see because they like to decorate themselves with things from the bottom of Lake Merritt, so they blend in really well. Usually I only find them when I've been looking for something else and all of a sudden the ground just gets up and walks away. These guys are so good at surviving with that other competition that they are now the invasive species that we've exported to Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. We also have the yellow shore crab, which is something you'll commonly find across the West Coast in Lake Merritt. However, I've noticed that as measured DD projects have kind of come online, we've been getting more tidal flow. I've been seeing less of this crab, and I'm not sure why that is, but it seems to be more outside of Lake Merritt now at the edge of the connection with the bay than in the lake. Any questions come up during that? Otherwise, I'm going to jump into mollusks.
I would just ask Damon, as you show these pictures, give us an idea of the scale. How big are they?
Okay,
You know,
good call, Joe. So Lake Merritt has a variety of mollusks that come from all over the world. The first one I'm going to talk about is this Asian date clam, aka the green bag mussel. These grow really quick, but they usually grow just during the summer months in the lake. And these, at their biggest, get to be about the size of a quarter. So they're not a really big thing, but they can be there in horrendous numbers. So this past year, they didn't dredge Lake Merritt from what I've seen. By dredge, I mean they've been going through and kind of pulling out clumps of algae during the summer to keep that from smelling. But they didn't do that last year. And so there are just these giant solid rafts of these where you could easily count tens of thousands of them within, a given, small space. And these obviously came in from bilge water from trade. The soft shell clams that we have in Lake Merritt, which are the easiest kind of bivalves to get a glance at, mainly because their shells are all over Lake Merritt, probably didn't come in from bilge water, but came in from oyster beds that were moved into Lake Merritt around the turn of the last century. These are native to the east coast of the United States. And we have a couple of organisms that seem like they showed up from the East Coast, probably on these oysters that were moved into Lake Merritt to be grown during that time. These can get to be relatively large. I think probably the largest one I've seen in Lake Merritt has been about the size of my cell phone, which, is good size for a clam. They grow also extremely rapidly. Like you can go from having these little rice grain things to, a cell phone in what feels like maybe a year to 2 years. And I'm sure it's partly because they have a lot of food to process. We also have a number of mussels in Lake Merritt. And these are also, a relatively good sized one, can get up to be about the size of a cell phone, although most are about half the size. This Atlantic rib mussel comes from the Mediterranean, where there's a lot of these kind of brackish water environments. So the really cool thing about this one is we see its numbers flux based upon salinity of the lake. So when Jim Carlton was here doing his studies, this was the predominant mussel in Lake Merritt. And its numbers have been dropping as we've been going through sequential drought years, causing kind of an oceanification of Lake Merritt, i.e. saltier water more of the time. This has started to disappear. And what we're starting to see more of is our West Coast blue mussel, Mytilus edulis, which is a little bit smaller, but this is also one of the mussels that traditionally people eat from our coastline. I probably wouldn't eat them from Lake Merritt until somebody does some really good water quality studies, because since they're filtering so much stuff, they probably have the chance to aggregate lots of stuff as well. We then have a lot of these more snail and slug type of mollusks that are in Lake Merritt that are a little bit harder to see, mainly because a lot of them try to blend in with what's going on at the bottom of the lake. One of the most notable ones is the Japanese bubble snail from kind of Japan, Taiwan, China region. And this has a clear shell. And so you'll find the shells of these occasionally, and they just look like these little tiny glass kind of pearls almost. But the reason they've got that clear shell is because the actual tissue of this organism perfectly matches the bottom of Lake Merritt. And so they are almost impossible to see unless you're just staring at one location for a long time. And then you realize there's all these little tiny things moving really slowly all over the place. Or if you see a large piece of trash in the lake, like cardboard, you can then really quickly kind of find them. They've got two kind of primitive eye spots on them. And these guys get to be in huge, huge numbers later in the summer. And they will also lay egg cases that are easy to find. Those egg cases tend to be about half a dime, and the bubble snails get to be at their largest the size of a quarter. Most of them are like the size of a nickel. One of our more impressive from a biological point of view mollusks in the lake is hedgepath's sapsucker. So this is actually named after a marine biologist born in Oakland, who was also kind of an iconoclast. He's definitely an Oakland character. But this organism does some really cool tricks from a biology point of view. You notice it's green, which is kind of weird for a lot of animals, right? The reason it is green is because as it's eating algae, it can actually steal the chloroplast from the algae and then incorporate it into its cellular matrix. So this organism is an animal that can actually benefit by photosynthesis. It can garner energy from chloroplast that it stole from algae for months, which is really kind of, you talk to anybody that hasn't had a biology class in the last 10 years and they're usually like, what? That seems crazy. And there's another one of these that has a really nice cover of the, I think, Journal of Science or Journal of Nature a couple years back, where it goes the next level and actually steals the RNA from the algae and then can build its own class, which is just wild. But this is really common in the summer months around Lake Merritt, especially on what's known as dead man's finger algae. We occasionally see one of California's largest soft-shelled mollusks, which is the sea hare in Lake Merritt during warm water events. Be the size of a rugby football, and they'll come to Lake Merritt to basically lay eggs, which more or less looks like somebody dropped a cup of ramen in the lake, and you're like, why is that there? And if you start looking, you realize that there's all of these giant sea hares kind of clustered around it. Our biggest kind of sea hare event happened, what was that? I want to say 2016, and we had about 150 of them show up in the lake. But really, really cool. These guys can also squirt ink, kind of like in the same way an octopus does to distract you. Nobody eats them because they incorporate toxins into their tissues based upon the organisms they're eating. They can steal their toxins and present them. So just kind of a really kind of cool wild organism. We also have smaller kind of nudibranch looking organisms in Lake Merritt. So we have a sea lettuce eater. So based on the common name there, you can guess what this thing eats. It eats the large kind of rafts of sea lettuce that show up in the lake. You see those little projections off its back. Those are known as sera. And so it will eat organisms, pick up some of the toxins, and then present them in those sera so that nobody eats it. So none of the fish and things like that will come by and eat this, kind of soft-bodied organism. We also have Placida dentrata, which is also very similar, has a very similar kind of feeding style on sea lettuce. We have another nudibranch organism named after hedgepath, which is Hedgepath's dorid. And this one gives you great warning signs not to eat it. It's got these projections at the head and that kind of clustering on the back that are nicely brightly colored, usually with blues and yellows. These guys will get to be about the size of a quarter. And so a lot of this is done with macro photography where I'll pick these organisms up, and because I live close, I'll take them back home, photograph them usually in my cereal bowl because it's nice and white with a macro lens, and then return them back to the lake afterwards. But these guys can be in good numbers throughout the year. This is one of the ones that you can expect to also find in the winter, not just during the summer at Lake Merritt. This was one that we found 2 years ago at Lake Merritt that really was kind of like a, whoa, Measure DD's done something. The Santa Barbara Janilis is a nudibranch you rarely see even in the San Francisco Bay. It likes being more in the coastal waters, which tells me that the water quality of Lake Merritt has gotten a lot better if something like this can be found here. And I showed this to Jim Carlson, and he was like, oh, I never saw that in all my years there. So this is definitely a new arrival of somebody colonizing the lake again because those water quality conditions are getting better, which is very cool to see. It's also doing the same thing, right, of aggregating toxins from the organisms it's eating and then presenting them in the sera on its back saying, don't eat me, I'm dangerous. And then we have a nudibranch that was named after Lake Merritt because that's where it was first discovered. The irony, though, is that it was probably not originally from Lake Merritt. The other places that you find this in the world are tropical habitats, namely the northeast corner of Brazil is where it seems the majority of these live. And so this probably somehow got its way here back in historical time on a boat. But the first time it was ever seen and identified as a new organism happened to be at Lake Merritt. And so that's why it has the name of Lake Merritt nudibranch. We also have gastropods in the lake, mollusks, right, that have a single shell. We have a lot of these eastern mud snails. These also came in on oyster beds from what we can tell. These can handle serious freshwater events. And so even during a big rain year, this is one of the mollusks that you'll see just plowing around the bottom of Lake Merritt all throughout the year. These can be about, half a silver dollar size at most, but usually they're in the kind of quarter size. We also get limpets in Lake Merritt, which are kind of cool organisms because these have evolved to be able to hang outside of the water for a long period of time during a tidal change, which you probably didn't need if, Lake Merritt was the way Lake Merritt's been for the last 100 years. But as we're getting more tidal flushing, I'm showing more limpets show up. So they actually have a gill that you can kind of see coming off of the head there that looks like a feathery boa. And they have all these projections on the outside of the cell. So when you're underwater, you're using that gill to do your oxygen exchange, your air exchange. And then when you're out of the water, you're clamped down against the rock, holding your moisture in, actually doing the air exchange off the outside of the mantle, which is kind of cool. We also have eastern oyster drill snails. These also probably came in with the oyster beds because these are an East Coast species. And this is the nemesis of every other mollusk in the lake that has a shell, because these can basically latch onto you, drill a hole through your cell, spit a bunch of enzymes inside of you, and then slurp that out as dinner. And so this is our major predator mollusk in Lake Merritt. Its eggs are kind of cool looking. You'll find these under rocks and logs in Lake Merritt very commonly. And then we also have one of the mollusks that does not look like a mollusk at all. And that's why it bears the name of shipworm. These are mollusks that have their shell all the way towards the front, and they have this long kind of worm-looking body. And what they do is they use the shell to actually drill into woody substrates. They then have enzymes that they dump out into the front that digest the cellulose and then turn it into sugars that they can then slurp up. This is the whole reason that Columbus's third voyage to the Americas took much longer than he expected, because his boat got eaten out by these. And same thing with Lake Merritt. You throw a piece of wood in there, beside that isopod, this is the other thing that will show up consistently on wood. And actually, when I was working at the National Labs, we were studying these because these are a great source of low temperature enzymes for breaking down woody substrates, which is really important if you're trying to build a biofuel economy. Any questions on the mollusks? I'll stop right there and handle any of those before we move on.
I believe Roger had a question.
No, it was a more general question about how you do your research, and are you down there with scuba gear, or how do you operate?
I don't go down with scuba gear. I've gone snorkeling in there a few times and found that wasn't really recovering me any more than what I get by just showing up in a pair of what used to be sandals, but I'm now in mud boots, going in there and usually turning over any kind of large things that have fallen in Lake Merritt, and more or less sorting through the things that happen on that. Because you got to remember, the majority of Lake Merritt, because it's an old tidal estuary, it's a muddy, silty bottom.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a whole bunch of stuff for things to grab onto, but as soon as you give something solid, everything grabs onto it. So it's really where you find the diversity in the lake.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yep. In fact, building upon that, what I'm going to do after this talk is I'm meeting Katie Noonan, who's a former high school teacher who's been running a program there for 30 years. And what she's done is drop these plastic plates that sit about a meter off the bottom. And then we pull those out and we'll look at what organisms have showed up on there after a given period of time. And it is mind-blowing how many things will stick to those in just a couple of months, let alone like half a year. We pulled one up that got put in September about 2 weeks ago. And it was like a piece of lucite. So not something I think about things easily attaching to. It was completely covered. We had, tunicates on there that were 4 or 5 inches, mussels already attached to it, all kinds of life.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
How deep is Lake Merritt?
At its deepest, it's 8 feet.
Okay.
It's relatively, shallow. And that's because of that kind of muddy bottom that gets mixed up and around and sediment coming down.
Mm-hmm.
Since they've opened the channel though, I don't think anybody's gone through and done a new survey of the lake bottom, but I would imagine because there's more flow, we might actually have a couple of deeper points getting put into the lake now, which would be cool to see. Any other questions? All right, into some of the other critters then. So we do have some flatworms that will show up in the lake. This is the inappropriate scientific name for this. So I don't know what species this is, but we do have a large number of these that will show up in the lake. These are about as thin as a piece of paper. They'll be about the size of a silver dollar at the largest. And they're completely see-through almost. So what we're looking at the bottom there is you can basically see the gonads, kind of that white kind of cosmos looking thing, and then the digestive tract, which is that branched looking structure. We do get cnidarians in Lake Merritt, and this is something that usually blows most people that walk around Lake Merritt away, because they'll see me in the lake and they're like, why are you touching the water? You're gonna catch some strange disease. And then you tell them, well, probably not. And are you aware that this is attached to the bay and that we've got marine organisms in here? And you can show them all those mollusks, and that usually doesn't sink in that you're dealing with a marine environment, but you show somebody a sea anemone and all of a sudden like the lights go on. And so we do have a lot of small sea anemones that proliferate in Lake Merritt during the summer months. The most common one is the orange striped green sea anemone, which is originally from Asia. And these don't get to be huge. I mean, I think the largest one I've seen has been pushing the size of a quarter. They're usually more dime size or smaller, but they'll be attached all over rocky substrates at the edge of most of the lake by September. There's a side shot of one so that you can kind of see, you know, that they're what they look like. They've got just a basic GI tract. They basically bring things in, eat it, dump out the stuff that wasn't used, and then repeat the process. We also, though, get things like jellyfish in Lake Merritt. So we get the Pacific sea nettle every once in a while in Lake Merritt. We'll get bell medusas in Lake Merritt. And we will also get the moon jellyfish in Lake Merritt. These aren't super common to see, and most of them are just coming in from the tidal, you know, exchange with the San Francisco Bay. But they'll get into the lake and they'll be there for a handful of days, and then they'll either get eaten in the lake or they'll get flushed back out. We also do occasionally see gooseberries, sea gooseberries in the lake, and these guys are really cool because the way the cilia run on their outside, if you've got them in the water and you're outside in the sunlight, you literally just see rainbows running up and down them as the cilia reflects sunlight differently. In fact, Monterey Bay Aquarium, I think, uses these in some of their displays because they're kind of so visually intriguing. Outside the cnidarians, we'll get into basically our marine worms, the polychaetes. We have a huge diversity of polychaetes in Lake Merritt from all over the world. We have these large clam worms, and these ones can get to be, I think the largest one I found in Lake Merritt's been about a foot. I used to handle these all the time, not thinking about it much, and then somebody showed me the jaws on these, and these could definitely do some damage if they got a hold of you. So I've been a little more cautious now about picking them up, but these are traditionally going after any of these clams or mussels that have been stressed by freshwater events. They'll go in there and kind of eat them. And I've got a researcher in Southern California who's working on samples that we've sent down there because they think that there's actually been one of these living in Lake Merritt long enough that it's evolved enough that we can say that there might be a subspecies or a species from Lake Merritt there, which is kind of cool. One of the ones that's easy to spot in Lake Merritt is this Typhoscilus nipponica from Japan. These are in huge numbers right now, and they're one of the polychaetes that go through a very interesting breeding strategy that a handful of polychaetes will use, which is known as epitocoism. So instead of basically finding your life partner, breeding with them, you know, adult to adult, what they will do is, so that they don't put themselves in danger of swimming out into the water column, they will send all of their gametes down to their bottom half and then bud off their bottom half into a free swimming organism that will go around and find other versions of these until they get together into a mating ball, and then they'll lyse open, and then the gametes can basically exchange. And so in this photograph, you can see this one looks like it's pinched at the bottom. that is actually it starting to go through its epitoke phase. And the next slide is actually of the epitoke. So it basically does a color change. It gets its own eye spots, and it's got enough setae that it can swim. And we're starting to see these up at the surface of Lake Merritt right now, swimming around looking for other epitokes, which is kind of wild. It's a very unique breeding or reproduction strategy, but it keeps the adult safe. We also have other ones that go through epitokes in the lake that are really brightly colored. I've only found this twice in Lake Merritt. This is originally from Australia, but you can actually see it buds off many epitokes at once. And this thing is, you know, was about maybe a fifth the size of a dime. So really, really, really small. This was only the second time it was seen in the United States. The other time it was seen down in Long Beach Harbor. We also have spaghetti worms in the lake. These guys can get up to be about a foot long. The majority of the worm basically hides out in a mud tube and then sends up tentacles up to the surface where it can grab food and then bring it down to the mouth. Here's one of those actually pulled out of its tube and photographed with a little more high detail. And so you can actually see the air exchange, kind of the gills at the front there, that branching, and then you can see some of the tentacles. And the setae in these ones, the little kind of things you see sticking off the side, they use that to more or less hold themselves, you know, into their little mud hole, which is kind of cool. We also have scaled worms, another type of polychaete. And these guys kind of do something that you might be familiar with butterflies doing, is they will produce markings that look like a bunch of eyes to keep predators scared off. These can get up to be, you know, about the size of like, you know, your ring finger. And some of these will be really, really brightly colored, and those eye spots will be very, very noticeable. I'm not sure if there's a different type of season when these become more noticeable, but there's definitely a lot of variation with the eye patterning. Another kind of spaghetti worm-like thing that we've got in the lake. Another polychaete that we hadn't had documentation of that's only seemed to show up after measured DD, Marphasia. This one is an important one. This is one of those ones that Jim Carlton found way back in the day. There was really an aha moment because this polychaete originally comes from Australia. This one forms these really obvious kind of calcium carbonate tubes that then the worm lives inside of, and then it kind of sends out these little grabbers to then, you know, pull stuff out of the water column. These guys have actually become so problematic in Ventura Harbor that they have to go through and dynamite the harbor to get rid of the giant reefs that these will build. In Lake Merritt, it seems that the change in salinity kind of keeps them under control, so we've never seen it get to that level. But Jim Carlton noted when he was here last that they used to be much more abundant than what he sees right now in the lake. So they're obviously going through flux. And this is kind of what one of them looks like if you were to pull it out of the tube. This isn't specifically the one from Australia. This is one of the other tube worms that we can find in Lake Merritt. And then we have the stuff that's mostly closely related to corals that we can find in Lake Merritt. These are the bryozoans. So these are organisms that will live together in large colonies. These tend to produce really nasty toxins that actually a lot of those nudibranchs will eat and then present in their sera on their backs. And these tend to form kind of more or less films over rocks and things like that, or the most easy to find bryozoans in the lake. But you also have ones that almost look like an alga, where they'll form these kind of large branching bodies that will stick up in the water column. And if you were to pull it out and show it to most people, they would say, look at it and go, oh, that's a plant. But then when you get underneath a microscope and you look at it, you realize that each one of those is an individual polyp, and they're all living together kind of communally in the same way that a coral does. And then if you're to watch them with a microscope, and it's hard for you guys to see it on the screen, but you can see one of them in the center actually has one of its kind of feeder feet out there in the water column harvesting food. And that's the majority of the inverts in the Lake Merritt. And I'll just give you a handful of like the easy to see vertebrate stuff in the lake. So the bay pipefish makes its way into the lake very commonly. In fact, if I go through bird photographs of the lake when birds are eating things, like 6 times out of 10, they're eating a bay pipefish. These guys are kind of most analogous to like seahorses. They're very stiff. They'll curl up and grab stuff in the lake and kind of sit there until something goes by, and they'll kind of reach out and grab it to feed. And they get to be about Yeah, I think the largest one I've seen has probably been about 10 inches in Lake Merritt. We have a ton of the yellowfin goby from Australia that's in Lake Merritt. So if you walk around and you see a fish all of a sudden shoot out from beneath your shadow, it is usually this organism. In fact, there were so many that some guys got busted 10 years ago because they were going into Lake Merritt and then fishing these out in giant numbers to then sell them to bait shops, which I don't know, not that bad of a thing, I guess. But then the real take home one that when I show this to people, they go, okay, marine environment, is we will also get the California bat ray in Lake Merritt. You tend to see this in the summer months. It's in there feeding on a lot of the mollusks. So it'll just kind of go through and just graze a bunch of those Japanese bubble snails at once. But it's pretty easy to spot down at the Green Bridge portion of the Lake Merritt where the water flow is coming in. So it's best to see them usually on a tide change. They'll be there picking off things as water's being moved around. At that same location, the last year, I don't have photographs of it, but I've had reports of people seeing a salmon, people seeing a sturgeon, and we've had sea otters spotted there, not sea otters, sorry, freshwater otters spotted there, and a sea lion came in, I think 2 years ago. And so things are definitely finding their way back in as water quality is improving, which I think is a great sign. And that's kind of the quick look at the critters. I'll open it up for questions.
Well, I'd like to ask a question about exhibits. We're used to aquariums and other types of exhibits focusing on the native species and decrying the existence of these invasive species. And your stress is more on, look at all these invasive species, and isn't this amazing? We have this stuff from all over the world. And I wonder if there's ever any exhibits in an aquarium or other place that would feature this kind of stuff.
That's a really interesting question, Roger, because it's definitely something that, you know, brings out the kind of friction really quick when you talk about invasive species. Mm-hmm. And especially because as Lake Merritt's water quality has improved, I haven't necessarily seen more of the natives. Mm-hmm. In these equilibriums seem to get more balanced, where we don't have these huge, you know, booms that cause Lake Merritt to stink and stuff like that. I wish the Rotary Nature Center down at Lake Merritt, I wish the city of Oakland could afford to keep it open and operating, because I think that would be the appropriate place to have a display like that. Mm-hmm. Lake Merritt is actually a really good, maybe good's not the right word, is a strong example of an Anthropocene environment, right? Right. Mm-hmm. When you let stuff just get all over the place. And what you see is biology finds a way to get itself back in equilibrium, but you also probably lost a bunch of organisms in the process. And so I think the conversation between kind of biological equilibriums and species loss and biodiversity are like the two kind of competing narratives there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and people are very instrumental in moving all this stuff around, you know, so it's sort of hypocritical for us to say, oh, I wish we had the native environment back, you know. Well, who screwed it up in the first place?
Right.
And maybe it isn't so screwed up. Maybe it's like you say, it can reach its own new equilibrium.
Yep. And I'll be interested to see, as Lake Merritt has a couple more years with water quality being high, as more of those native kind of marsh plants come in, does that then cause a selective pressure towards more native organisms coming back into the lake too? We will see. I wish there was a quantitative study going on. We'll be able to qualitatively hopefully tell you, you know, 5-10 years down the road if we do start to see that.
Mm-hmm. I believe Natalie had a question.
Oops, I put it in the chat, but it's about a couple of those things look like they were sort of like coral, and I think that's what you mentioned. Some of them seem to even build a sort of a structure. And I found myself, since Lake Merritt is fairly warm, wondering about the destruction of the coral reefs throughout the world because of the warming seas. Is this something that could grow that could help them out?
I mean, a lot of those environments have bryozoans that are living there. And actually, if you're interested in that specific question, there is a group at Coconut Island on the backside of Oakland that is studying this very intently. And that they're mainly studying it there because the backside of Oahu has had lots of human waste making its way into a coral reef system, which has precipitated pH change and also warming waters in that area. And so they're actually hunting for corals there that have already had that evolutionary pressure.
Uh-huh.
What allows them to adapt, and can we encourage them to be, quicker ones that show up in areas where we're seeing coral reefs die off? But I mean, I think, at the level that it's happening, I think it's going to be hard for humans to supplement that very much at this point, like, sadly.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, Damon, I would really like to thank you for this presentation. The photography and your knowledge is just overwhelmingly good. Enthusiasm. And so thank you very much for your time today.
You're here.
I would like everybody else to stay on once we say goodbye to Damon, because I have some other news of upcoming events. And you're welcome to stay for that, Damon. But in the meantime, bravo.
All
Thank
right.
you so much,
Thank you
Damon.
guys thanks for having me. And this was fun. If you guys ever want something in kind of what's going on in biotech, feel free to come ask in a month or so once things settle down. I'm actually doing a lot of talks on CRISPR for high schools, so I could more or less give you what we're showing to the high school students as far as genome editing goes too. So
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
Oh, yeah, put that on the list. That sounds good.
Okay, you're on the
Okay.
list.
all right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day. I'm gonna run
Thank
down to
you,
Lake
Damon.
Merritt to do this water sampling.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.